On a Tuesday in 1984, at Dulles, a junior officer tapped a used Atari cartridge. The bargain sticker on the back was melted. It rattled when it shouldn't. In the case notes, that melted sticker would later unravel how a toy became a courier. Something inside didn't sit right. It shifted, then settled again, small weight, wrong place. The traveler on the other side of the table wore a neutral expression and kept his hands where they could be seen. Too still, too patient. The officer had learned to watch hands before faces. He was still on probation. One missing item could turn into a file with his name on it. He turned the cartridge over again. The sticker had softened and smeared, as if it had been heated, peeled, and pressed back down. He didn't know why that bothered him until he noticed the screws. The screw heads were cleaner than the plastic around them, not factory clean. Recently touched clean. He set the cartridge on the metal table. The rattle stopped. That was the moment he stopped thinking kid's toy and started thinking something carried. He looked at the label again. It said asteroids, but the label was worn in the way old labels get worn slow, careless years. The screws looked like they'd been turned this week. He slid the cartridge to the side and opened the logbook. He could have written Atari game and moved on. Instead, he wrote miscellaneous electronics. The traveler's eyes flicked to the pen, then to the officer's hands, then away like he was counting seconds. No argument, no surprise. The officer tagged the item and dropped it into the evidence bin with the other seized electronics. He shut the lid, checked the tag number twice, and moved to the next inspection. An hour later, he came back for a routine inventory check. The bin was in the same place. The lid sat the same way, but the cartridge was gone. He opened the sign-out sheet. There was one line filled in during the last hour. The sign-out line showed his name in fresh ink. So who carried it out? The missing cartridge didn't become a headline in the building. It became a quiet gravity pulling every small mistake toward your name. The inspection room kept running the way it always did. Bags on tables, radios in trays, watches in small plastic tubs, fluorescent light, burnt coffee, a wall clock nobody trusted, a steady stream of travelers pretending they weren't tired. For a junior officer, the job was repetition. Hands, pockets, paper, stamps, tags. He'd learned the rhythm the hard way. Don't get creative. Don't get angry. Don't get memorable. On probation, memorable was just another word for replaceable. He'd signed the sign-out sheet 100 times without thinking. A pen chained to a clipboard. A line for time. A line for item. A line for initials. The whole system worked because it assumed the people inside it were basically honest. And right now, all he knew was simple. A seized Atari cartridge was missing, and the paper insisted he'd carried it out. The desk sergeant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He flipped the sheet around and pointed at the entry like it was a stain. The officer leaned in and saw the initials again, his, but slightly wrong. The slant was off. The last stroke was too heavy, like someone trying to be him in a hurry. "You're telling me I did this?" he asked. The sergeant's expression wasn't sympathy and wasn't anger. It was older than both, like a man watching someone step onto thin ice. Nobody said spy. Nobody said crime. They said words like misfiled and misplaced, the safe words that kept a problem small. A missing screwdriver could be misplaced. A missing bag could be misplaced. A missing cartridge could be misplaced, too, until the wrong person decided it wasn't. He was told to write a short statement, just facts. No opinions. He sat at a metal desk with a blank form and a carbon sheet underneath. The carbon paper made every letter a duplicate and every tremor a confession. He felt his hand shake only when the pen hovered. The carbon paper forced pressure. It recorded how hard you meant it. Across the room, other officers moved on to the next traveler. Their eyes slid past him like he was furniture. He wrote what he could defend. The item came in. He tagged it. He logged it. He placed it in the bin. He didn't write the part he couldn't prove, the two still hands, the clean screws, the rattle that stopped on metal. He didn't write asteroids. He didn't write what his gut had said, because guts don't survive audits. That was his first small decision. Keep it clean. Keep it simple. At home that evening, the house didn't care. The sink was full. The phone bill sat under a magnet. His wife had circled the due date in red and left it on the counter like a quiet dare. He tried to eat dinner standing up. He kept checking his knuckles for ink. She asked how work went, and he gave her the kind of answer that keeps a night from turning into a long talk. Fine. Busy. Same as usual. Then he kissed her forehead and walked the trash out, because movement was easier than explaining. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet in that blunt suburban way, cars parked nose in, windows dark, a TV glow across the street. He did the math he always did. If he lost this job, the rent didn't shrink, the grocery bill didn't soften, the little cushion in their checking account would vanish in a week, maybe less. Back at work the next day, he tried to treat it like a mistake that could be corrected. That was the false normal. If you explained it as routine error, it stayed reversible. He asked to see the evidence ledger again. He asked like it was ordinary. The evidence room clerk slid the book over without looking up. The pages were soft from use. Names repeated. Items repeated. Ink changed from shift to shift. He found his entry and ran a finger under the line. The tag number was right. The category was his, miscellaneous electronics. But the handwriting on the sign-out line still bothered him. It looked like someone imitating him from memory, not copying him from sight. The kind of imitation that worked if nobody stared too long. He glanced at the clerk's hands. Clean nails, steady grip. The clerk said items moved around all the time. Overflow bins, secondary checks, supervisors pulling samples. It was delivered like comfort, but it sounded like permission. He could push. He could make noise. Or he could let the system solve itself and hope the paper trail drifted back into place. That was the second decision, forming the one that mattered more. Speak up and risk becoming a problem, or stay quiet and keep his paycheck intact. He chose quiet. He told himself it was temporary. He'd give it a day. He'd ask again later, when it wouldn't look like panic. He'd keep his head down and let the older men handle missing property the way they always did. But on his way out, he passed the evidence bin area and noticed something small that didn't belong. A fresh strip of clear tape on the lid seam, placed neat as a fingernail. It wasn't sealing anything. It was a marker. A selection. He kept walking like he hadn't seen it, because he could feel eyes on him without turning around. By that night, the statement he wrote had already been copied and filed, and his name was now attached to a missing object he couldn't prove he never held, which meant someone else could now decide what he'd done with it. By Thursday, the missing cartridge had done its first real damage. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No handcuffs. Just a clean little adjustment like the building had found a way to punish him without admitting it was punishing him. His overtime disappeared. A supervisor who used to nod at him stopped nodding, and when he reached for the evidence room door that morning, his badge beeped once and stayed red until the clerk inside buzzed him through. Temporary, the clerk said, not meeting his eyes. Temporary was how they kept you obedient. At his station, 2 senior officers talked over his shoulder as if he were a chair. Their voices dropped whenever he turned his head. It wasn't paranoia if you could measure it. He told himself to stay calm and do what he'd been trained to do, turn anxiety into procedure. So he went back to the first thing he could touch, the paperwork. He requested the traveler's intake details again. The way you request a tray count. Routine, boring, nothing personal. The file came down in a thin folder that looked too small to hold this much risk. The passport number was clean. The name was common. The address was acceptable. Acceptable was the problem. He read it once, then again, slower. A street that existed, sure, but the zip code didn't match the county. The phone number had 1 digit too many. The kind of error that shouldn't survive a real booking unless someone wanted it to survive. He walked the folder to a coworker he trusted as much as you could trust anyone in a room where everything had a chain and a lock. "Does this look off to you?" he asked. The coworker scanned it, then pushed it back like it was hot. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't make this a thing." That was the first honest sentence anyone had given him, and it came dressed as advice. At lunch, he ate in his car because the break room felt like a stage. He sat with the folder on the passenger seat and listened to radio static swell between stations. Every surge of hiss dragged his mind back to the melted sticker, the bright screws, and the rattle that went dead the moment it touched metal like it learned how to behave. He tried the straightforward route anyway. He asked the desk sergeant if the cartridge had been moved to secondary review. The sergeant didn't answer at first. He checked the hallway, then spoke with his face angled toward the paperwork instead of toward him. "There's no cartridge," he said. "There's a record of a cartridge. That record says I signed it out. It says a lot of things. Hell, so what am I supposed to do?" The sergeant tapped his pen once, one sharp knock, controlled and slid a new form toward him. More statements, more lines, another carbon sheet waiting to copy his pressure. "You're supposed to keep working," the sergeant said, "and stop touching evidence you can't account for." The last part landed like a warning, not advice. That afternoon, rumors reached him in pieces carried by people who didn't mean to help him. A clerk had seen something game-sized on a supervisor's desk. Someone else said the evidence bin seal had been retaped. A third voice, barely a whisper, said the traveler from Tuesday had been seen again in the terminal. Not through customs this time. Just passing by, empty-handed, like a man checking whether a door stayed unlocked. None of it was usable. All of it made his skin feel too tight. He made a choice that felt small in the moment. He stopped trying to solve it through channels. After his shift, he drove past a hardware store and bought a tiny screwdriver set with money he didn't want to spend. He told himself it was just to quiet his brain, to prove the rattle was nothing, to stop imagining hidden compartments like he was a kid reading spy novels. At home, he waited until the kitchen lights were dim and the house sound softened, water running, a TV laugh track from the living room, his wife moving around without asking questions. Then he went to the hall closet where he kept his work jacket. He checked the pockets like he was searching for something he'd lost. He didn't have the cartridge. Of course he didn't. But he did have something else. The intake tag number he'd written down earlier on a scrap of paper. A number he wasn't supposed to have outside the building. It sat in his palm like guilt that hadn't happened. He stared at that number until he admitted what he was really doing, trying to build a defense without evidence, trying to prove a negative, trying to protect himself with air. That was when the phone rang. His wife answered. Her voice shifted into the polite version she used for strangers. She said his name once, then covered the receiver and looked at him like the room had changed shape. "It's for you," she said. "From work." He took the call. No one introduced themselves. A man's voice, low and clipped, asked him where he was. He answered. The voice paused, as if the answer had been expected, not received. "Don't come in early tomorrow," the voice said. "Come in at your scheduled time." Why?" A faint click of line settling into place. "Because you're not to be alone in the building." The line went dead. He stood there holding the receiver while the dial tone buzzed softly into his ear. A thin electronic hiss under ordinary life, like something listening from the other side of nothing. His wife asked what it was. He told her it was nothing schedule nonsense because he couldn't afford to scare her with a problem he couldn't even name. That night, he slept in shallow pieces. Every time he drifted off, he saw the sign-out sheet with his name written by someone else. He heard the rattle, then the sudden quiet, like a lesson being learned. In the morning, he went in exactly on time. His supervisor met him before he reached his station. No greeting, no small talk, just a clipboard held tight to the chest. "You're reassigned today," the supervisor said. "To where?" "Desk duty." "Intake only." "That's a demotion." It's a precaution." The supervisor's eyes flicked to the hallway behind him, then back. Even his supervisor spoke like the walls had ears. At the intake desk, he did what he was told. He stamped forms. He counted items. He avoided the evidence bins like they were a trap, which, in a way, they were. Around midday, the desk sergeant returned and set down a plain brown envelope without a word. Inside was a single, photocopied page, an airline record request printout. The traveler's name appeared, but beneath it were two variations, two spellings, two middle initials, two different addresses attached to the same passport number on different dates. Not proof, but enough to turn his stomach. The sergeant leaned in, close enough that only he could hear. "You didn't get that from me," he said. "What is this?" he whispered. The sergeant's jaw tightened once. "A man who doesn't want to be found," he said. "And an object somebody wants moved without fingerprints." Then he added the part that mattered most, the part that made the room tilt. "They're saying you signed it out," he said. "That means the next thing they'll say is you had it long enough to do whatever was done to it." The officer stared at the printout, two names. One passport, a person wearing paperwork the way a person wears a coat. That closed one question and opened a worse one. The traveler wasn't just a traveler. So what was the cartridge? He looked down at his own hands on the desk, steady, flat, visible, and understood what had been wrong in the inspection room. The traveler's hands weren't still because he was calm. They were still because he didn't need to touch anything. The touching had already been done by someone who belonged inside, and whoever that was had picked a scapegoat who would try to survive by staying quiet. Not anymore. By the next week, the story stopped feeling like a single mistake. It started with the bins, not the people, not the rumors. The bins. He was still on intake, still fenced away from the evidence room unless someone buzzed him through, but intake had its own inventory rhythm. Items came in, tags got written, categories got chosen, and if you looked back far enough, the building accidentally told you what it cared about. He began keeping his own tiny record on a scrap of paper folded into his wallet. Nothing fancy, just tag numbers and categories. The kind of note you could swallow, burn, or deny depending on how the day went. The first pattern wasn't Atari. The first pattern was miscellaneous. Watches went in as watches. Radios went in as radios. But anything that could hide something, anything that could be explained away as junk electronics, had a way of landing in the same vague bucket. And the vague bucket was where things disappeared. He told himself that was normal. He told himself it was lazy bookkeeping. But then a second game cartridge came through. Different traveler, different day, same dull room. The label was different, but the screws looked too clean again. When he tapped it against his palm, something inside shifted, then settled. That same wrong little thunk, like a part finding its seat. He didn't seize it. He didn't want to look like a man hunting ghosts. Instead, he watched the traveler's hands. Flat, still, patient. The same stillness as the first man. A third one appeared 2 days later, tucked into a child's carry-on under crayons and a paperback. The parent looked exhausted. The kid looked bored. The cartridge looked handled. That's when coincidence started to rot. He needed a reality check, something simple enough to say out loud. Here's what he knew. Items were vanishing, and his name had already been used once, so he did the safest thing he could do without permission. He started asking boring questions. He asked the clerk which incoming flights were causing the most seizures lately, like he was curious about workload. He asked another officer which days the inspection tables felt overloaded. He asked a supervisor careful whether toy electronics were being flagged more than usual. No one gave him a direct answer. They gave him expressions, a tightening jaw, a glance toward the hallway, a hand that stopped mid-gesture, then kept moving like nothing happened. Silence, again. Not empty, silence managed, silence. On Friday, he was allowed into the evidence room for 10 minutes to identify a tray of items he'd logged. The clerk stayed by the door, pretending not to watch him, but watching him anyway. He kept his eyes down. He moved like a man who was afraid of breaking glass. And still, he saw it. A small stack of game cartridges sat on a side shelf, not in the main bins. They were arranged too neatly for a casual overflow pile. He didn't touch them. He didn't even walk toward them. He just noted what was on top. A cartridge with a bargain sticker that looked softened at the edges, as if it had been warmed and pressed flat again. He forced himself to keep moving. He forced himself to keep breathing. When he left, he caught a detail he wouldn't have noticed a month ago. A strip of clear tape on the corner of a storage lid, laid down like a marker. Not sealing. Labeling, quietly declaring, "This one." He didn't sleep well that night. In the morning, He used his day off to do something that felt stupid and necessary. He drove to a shopping center and walked into an electronics repair shop that smelled like solder and dust. He didn't bring a cartridge. He didn't bring a badge. He brought a question. He asked the man behind the counter, casual, like it was a joke whether people ever hid things inside game cartridges. The man shrugged the way people shrug when they're asked the wrong kind of question. He said yes, sometimes. Kids did it. People did it. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that the easy way to tell was the screws. Old plastic didn't take kindly to being opened and closed again. Fresh screws in old plastic always looked wrong. The officer thanked him and left with nothing in his hands. But the wrongness felt sharper, now validated by someone who didn't care about his job, his file, his name. Back at home, the bills were still stacked on the counter. His wife was still trying not to ask why overtime had dried up. He tried to act normal. He tried to be gentle, but his head kept returning to the same thought. If there were multiple cartridges, then his missing one wasn't a fluke. It was a method. On Monday, the method showed its teeth. He arrived at his scheduled time and found two men waiting near the intake desk with clipboards. They weren't from his unit. Their shoes were too clean for baggage dust, and they carried themselves like people who never had to apologize for taking up space. They asked him to step into a small office. The questions started ordinary. Name, position, shift. Then they circled the cartridge again, as if it had become the only object in his life. Where was he when it went missing? Who had access to the bin? Had he ever taken seized items home by accident? He answered slowly. He kept his hands visible. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't offer theories. That was his old instinct, silence as safety, working overtime. But one of the men asked a question that changed the air. Had he spoken about the cartridge outside the building? He felt his stomach drop. Not because he had, because the question meant someone was watching for leaks, and his anxiety now looked like one. When the interview ended, they didn't threaten him. They didn't reassure him either. They simply reminded him that chain of custody was serious, and that people lost their jobs over less. Then, they left him in the office long enough for the quiet to become humiliating. Time passed. Cost landed. That was how the building worked. By the end of the shift, his supervisor told him not to leave the property for lunch anymore. Desk duty meant desk. For now, the restriction sounded temporary. It felt like a leash short enough to keep him from wandering into answers. That evening, his wife came home with a new stiffness in her shoulders, like she'd carried something heavy and didn't want to set it down. Two men had visited her workplace. They asked for her by name. They asked polite questions about him. How long had they been married? Did he bring work home? Did he ever seem under pressure? She said they weren't rude. That almost made it worse. Rude people were easy to dismiss. She asked him what was going on. He had a clean chance to tell the truth, to let her into the problem before it grew teeth. He could have said, "Someone used my name. Someone took a cartridge. Someone is shaping the paperwork like clay." Instead, he minimized. He called it an internal issue. He called it inventory. He called it temporary. He watched her face as she decided whether to believe him. He hated that he'd trained her to doubt him the same way the building did. That night, he stood at the kitchen sink and listened to the refrigerator hum. The sound was steady until the phone line clicked once soft, almost polite, and then settled again. A tiny hiss under ordinary life. He froze with his hands in the dishwater. It might have been nothing. A neighbor picking up a receiver. A line adjusting. Or it might have been what the cartridges were for. Sound turned into signal. Normal turned into evidence. The next day at work, he did the first openly risky thing he'd done since the cartridge vanished. He asked to review older seizure logs. Not his shift, not last week. Older. He framed it as training, as curiosity, as wanting to understand trends. He smiled when he asked. He made it sound harmless. A tired clerk eventually slid a stack of ledgers across the counter. For an hour, he sat with those books and let repetition do what it always did, turn noise into shape. The same vague category. The same toy descriptions. The same days clustered around certain incoming flights. Not every time. Not enough to look obvious at first glance. Just enough to be useful if you knew what you were looking for. And as he flipped pages, he saw another repeatable detail. Notes in the margins that weren't official little marks officers made for themselves. A small star. A circled tag number. A line drawn under miscellaneous electronics. Human fingerprints on paper, those marks clustered around the same corridor of days. The same type of items. The same quiet vanishings. He realized something simple and brutal. The system didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be consistent enough that no one wanted to dig. He closed the ledger and wrote down 3 tag numbers that matched the pattern, 3 cartridges, 3 similar notes, 3 entries that led into blanks. He was building his own case now, not on authority, on repetition. At the end of the shift, he walked to the parking lot with his keys in his hand and the folded paper in his wallet, and he noticed a sedan idling 1 row over with its lights off. The driver didn't look at him. The car didn't move. He kept walking anyway, because turning your head felt like giving permission. When he pulled into his neighborhood, the sedan was gone. Maybe it had never been there. Maybe it had. Inside, his wife was quiet, too quiet, sitting at the table with her hands flat on the wood like she was copying someone else's posture. She told him the men had called again. This time they asked whether he owned an Atari. He felt the room tilt, because that question meant they weren't just investigating a missing cartridge anymore. They were mapping his life around it. And if they were asking her, then someone else was already answering. He stood there with his coat still on, trying to decide whether silence was still safer than truth. And the phone clicked softly again, like a reminder. He had 3 tag numbers. He had a pattern. Now he needed one more thing. A way to prove it before the pattern proved him. By midweek, the 3 tag numbers in his wallet felt heavier than his keys. He didn't show them to his wife. He didn't write them at home. He kept them folded tight, like cash you shouldn't have. At work, he waited for a moment that looked ordinary, the kind of lull the building used to swallow mistakes. Intake slowed. A clerk changed trays. A supervisor passed without stopping. Then he slipped into the desk sergeant's line of sight and set the paper down face up. No drama. 3 numbers. 3. Miscellaneous electronics entries. 3 blanks where the trail should have continued. The sergeant read them once, then didn't touch the paper. He stared at it like it could stain. "You didn't get these from me," the sergeant said. The officer nodded. That was the language here. No ownership. No witnesses. The sergeant told him to come back after shift. Not early. Not late. On time, like a man who wasn't sneaking toward trouble, even if trouble had already learned his name. That night, the officer ate dinner with his coat still on. His wife asked again why 2 men had walked into her workplace and asked whether he owned an Atari. She said it calmly, but her fork stopped moving while she waited for the answer. He gave her the clean version. Inventory issue. Misuse of his name. Internal review. He left out the part that mattered. The pattern didn't feel internal anymore. Then he told her he might be late the next day. He didn't say why. After his shift, the sergeant led him down a back hallway and into a small office with a metal desk and a fan that clicked once per rotation. 2 men were already there, plain shirts, clipped posture, the kind of quiet that didn't invite questions. They didn't introduce themselves with titles. They didn't need to. They asked him to walk through the moment the Atari cartridge vanished. No theories, just sequence. Where he stood, where the bin was, who had been within arm's reach, what the traveler looked at while he wrote. The officer answered in observations. Hands, pen, label, screw heads, the rattle that stopped when the cartridge touched metal. One of the men slid a cartridge across the desk. It looked ordinary on purpose, scratched label, cheap plastic, the sort of thing you'd find under a couch. But when the officer tapped it against his palm, something inside shifted, then settled. His stomach made the decision before his mouth did. It was the same wrongness. They weren't asking him to identify a game. They were asking him to recognize a method. Right now, he was still the man whose name was on the sign-out sheet. The plan they offered was simple enough to understand and dirty enough to change him. A controlled reintroduction. A cartridge that would be seized again, logged again, and placed where it could be taken this time with eyes on the hand that took it. No speeches about patriotism. No talk of history. Just a choice. Stay clean and stay powerless. Or help bait the hook and accept what it would look like on paper if something went wrong. The officer said yes, anyway. That was the line he crossed. Not because he wanted to be brave, but because the alternative was to wait for paperwork to finish him. They didn't hand him authority. They handed him rules. Do exactly what you always do. Process the item. Log it. Don't confront anyone. Don't improvise. Then they added the part that made it feel like a trap. He had to be the one to touch it. If the wrong person later said the wrong thing, his fingerprints would be the simplest story in the room. The next afternoon, the cartridge came in through a staged inspection. A traveler, a routine tray, a plain face that didn't matter. The officer logged it under the same vague category, miscellaneous electronics, because the vague category was the hallway the scheme kept walking down. He tagged it. He initialed it. Before he dropped it into the bin, he tapped it once against the metal lip, the way he'd tapped the first one. The rattle stopped. A signal, repeated on purpose like knocking on a door you knew someone behind it had been avoiding. He walked away and forced himself not to look back, because the cameras, if they were on, would love a man who looked guilty. An hour later, he was told to step out for air. Not outside the building, just out of the room. A controlled absence, the kind that created opportunity without creating an alibi. He stood by a vending machine and listened to the fan above him click, click, click. He watched people pass and tried to memorize shoes, tried to memorize hands. Hands were everything. When he went back in, the evidence bin was intact. The lid sat the same way. A neat strip of clear tape marked the seam, but the cartridge was gone. This time, the sign-out sheet had a name. Not his. A supervisor's initials, someone who didn't need to forge handwriting. The officer didn't react. He couldn't. He just logged the time in his head and let the men in plain shirts react somewhere out of sight. By evening, he was sitting in the passenger seat of an unmarked car rolling down a familiar corridor of strip malls and low office buildings in Arlington. The streetlights were thin and orange. The car radio stayed off. The silence inside the vehicle felt manufactured. They stopped near a payphone outside a laundromat. A man in a windbreaker approached the phone without hurrying. He didn't dial at first. He just stood with his back half turned to the street, like he was listening for a sound that wasn't a sound. Then he dialed fast, hung up before it could ring twice, and walked to a newspaper box. He crouched, reached behind it, and pulled out a small plastic rectangle wrapped in a folded grocery receipt, an Atari cartridge. No handshake, no meeting, just a location doing the talking. That closed one question the officer had been carrying since Dulles, where the missing items went. They didn't go missing. They went to places built for quick exchanges and plausible deniability, and as the windbreaker stood, the officer caught a detail that tightened his throat. The windbreaker's wrist turned just enough to show a clipped lanyard under the sleeve, government issue style, not tourist. A familiar shade of plastic, the kind you saw in his own building. The car stayed still. The men beside him stayed still. Nobody moved yet, because now, the next question was worse than the first. If the pickup man belonged inside, who else did? They didn't grab the windbreaker at the payphone. Not yet. From the unmarked car, the officer watched him tuck the wrapped cartridge into his coat like it was nothing, like it was a pack of cigarettes, and walk away without hurry. The men beside the officer let him go, because the pickup wasn't the end of the line. A pickup man could be replaced. The hardware couldn't. They followed at a distance through Arlington's late-evening traffic, past strip malls and dark office parks, until the windbreaker slipped into the shadow of a parking garage and didn't come out the way he should have. A tradecraft trick. A dead angle. A clean loss. The car stopped 2 blocks later. One of the plain shirt men finally spoke in a voice that carried no comfort at all. "We don't need him," he said. "We need what he carries." Back at the field office, the cartridge lay on a stainless table under a harsh lamp. Up close, it looked cheaper than it had any right to look. Scuffed label, dull plastic, Bargain sticker glue turned tacky at the edges. The officer could still feel the moment it had gone quiet when it hit metal. They photographed it, weighed it, measured it against a factory cartridge from the same era. Then a technician in latex gloves placed it on a rubber mat and pointed at the screws. "Newer than the shell," the tech said. "Same thing you noticed." The tech backed the screws out slowly, counting turns, like the cartridge could bite. When the top half lifted, the answer to the rattle revealed itself. Inside wasn't just a game board. There was a second, thinner board, piggybacked beneath the original, an extra layer that didn't belong. A small coil wound tight as a spring. A black epoxy blob hiding components. A thin wire routed toward the edge of the casing where it could kiss the Atari connector pins. The rattle hadn't been a loose screw. It had been the extra board shifting against the plastic until it found the one position where it wouldn't be heard. The officer swallowed. So it really was something. If we have to 7 to ported to 7 to doll. The tech didn't even look up. It was always something. The question was, what kind? They rebuilt it without sealing it, then carried it into a cramped test room with a television on a rolling cart and an Atari 2600 set up like a prop from a family den. A clamp meter looped around the power lead. A scope sat nearby. On the far table, an old radio receiver waited with its antenna half extended. The tech inserted a normal cartridge first. Numbers settled. Hum stayed steady. No surprises. Then he inserted the seized cartridge. The current draw jumped small, but wrong, like a heart skipping a beat and pretending it didn't. The technician watched the meter, then nodded toward the receiver. "Turn it on," he said. The officer expected nothing. That's what he'd been trained to expect from toys. The receiver answered with a thin hiss, then a tiny stutter of sound, brief, rhythmic bursts that didn't match any broadcast station. Not music, not voices, just short, repeating chirps that came in clusters. The screen showed a game title. Bright colors, blocky letters. Innocent. Under it, the cartridge kept working. The tech moved the receiver closer to the TV's coax lead. The chirps grew stronger. Then he moved it away, and the chirps softened. Back toward the cable, stronger again. "The television lead is acting like an antenna," he said. "Not unusual. It's a long piece of metal in a room. Easy to couple to." He pointed at the scope. "See that? Bursts? Repeatable. Timed." "Timed to what?" the officer asked. The tech tapped the console gently with a knuckle. "Time to the cartridge running." The officer stared at the screen at the harmless game loop and felt the floor shift under the past month of his life. So it wasn't just a container, it was alive when powered. The tech adjusted a knob on the receiver until the chirps clarified into a pattern. Short, short, long, a pause, then short, long, short, like a machine speaking in punctuation. He recorded a segment onto tape, rewound it, and played it again. Same pattern, same timing. "Low power," the tech said. "Short bursts. Enough to hide in the noise. Whatever it is," the tech said, "it wants to be heard by the right listener. Probably close by. Probably parked somewhere outside the house where this gets used, or outside a base apartment, or outside a building." The officer's mouth was dry. "So, if someone plugs it in at home, it transmits," the tech said. "Low power, bursts, enough to pass data without drawing attention." "What data?" the officer asked. The tech looked at him like the answer didn't help. "That depends on what gets put into it." Frand was also distorted. The plain shirt men stepped in then, and the air changed from lab curiosity to consequence. One of them held up a folder with chain of custody sheets clipped inside. "Now we close the other half," he said. How it walked out. They laid the paperwork across the table like a map. "Your missing cartridge. The controlled one. The older blanks in the ledgers. The supervisor's sign-out that didn't require forged handwriting. The evidence room access logs showing who was physically present when each miscellaneous electronics item moved. Not one name. A cluster. Then they put a photocopy beside it, your original sign-out line, the one under your name. "Look at the pressure," one man said. "Heavy start, lighter finish, like someone writing fast while trying to mimic your slant." He compared it to routine handwriting samples elsewhere in the ledger, unimportant entries, not signatures. The forms didn't accuse anyone by themselves. But side by side, the habit showed through. The way the M rose, the way the S curled. The officer felt sick, not because he was surprised, because he wasn't. He thought of the evidence room lids marked with clear tape, the neat pile of cartridges on the side shelf, the clerk who never met his eyes. One of the men opened a different folder. Financial review notes, thin, unofficial. A recent cash deposit. A new purchase paid in full. Nothing grand. Just enough money to look like a reason small enough to hide inside normal life. "Why me?" the officer asked. Because the question had been living in him like a splinter. The answer came without drama. "Because you were new," the man said. "Because you were on probation. Because if you protested, it would look like panic. And if you stayed quiet, the paperwork would finish you. Your fingerprints were the bait," the man added, "and the form was the hook. To hear vows. Silence as a tool. Not just yours, theirs." That was the moment the officer understood the still hands of the traveler at Dulles. The traveler didn't need to touch the cartridge because someone inside the building had already done the real work. They didn't arrest the clerk immediately. They did something worse. They let the clerk make one more choice. The next day, they staged another cartridge seizure, same vague category, same placement, same clear tape marker. The officer watched from intake, hands flat, face neutral, while the machine ran the same method again. An hour later, the evidence room door opened, and the clerk stepped out with a clipboard, moving too casually for someone who was just checking inventory. He signed out the item under the same supervisor's authority as before, clean and official, then slipped toward the rear exit. That was the tell. Not speed. Confidence. That's when two men in plain shirts closed in from either side. No shouting. No television drama. Just a hand on an elbow. A quiet request. A second hand on the clipboard. They walked the clerk back inside. The officer didn't hear the words exchanged in the back office. He only saw the clerk's face as the door swung shut, still, almost patient, the way the travelers had been. Stillness wasn't calm. Stillness was practice. Later, the officer was pulled into the same small office where his statement had first been duplicated on carbon paper. They told him he was no longer under suspicion for theft. But they also told him something that hit harder because it was said politely. His clearance review would continue. His access would remain limited for now. He would be reassigned, pending administrative outcome. In other words, the cartridge had been proven, the framing exposed, the method dismantled, yet the stain on his name didn't vanish just because the truth showed up late. He went home that night with a fact he couldn't fully share and a victory that didn't feel like one. His wife asked whether it was over. He looked at her hands on the table, flat, visible, searching his face, and he made the opposite choice from before. He spoke, not everything, not names, but enough truth to stop the silence from doing their work for them. "I didn't take anything," he said, "and it wasn't an accident." The refrigerator hummed. The phone line stayed quiet. No click, no hiss. Just ordinary sound finally allowed to be ordinary. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like it belonged to them again, even if his job no longer did. The building never said thank you. It didn't say sorry either. 2 weeks after the arrest, the junior officer's reassignment became temporary, in the way a stain becomes temporary when nobody scrubs it hard enough. Intake paperwork, inventory counts, training new hires on rules he was no longer trusted to use. He still wore the badge. He just didn't go where the badge used to open doors. He had proved the truth, yet the building treated him like a question mark that refused to erase. The official line was simple. Administrative review. The unofficial line was simpler. Once your name touched a missing item, it never fully let go. At home, the consequences arrived in quieter forms. Overtime never came back. His wife started buying cheaper cuts of meat and stopped circling due dates in red. She didn't need to. The calendar had become its own threat. When the mail hit the floor, They both looked at it the same way, like it might contain a new rule. Some nights he tried to talk about what had happened, but the words came out clipped, stripped of names and details he still couldn't share. That secrecy didn't protect them anymore. It just moved the investigation into their kitchen. Silence was safer. Silence was also how other people did their work through you. One Saturday, his son asked if they could go to the mall and look at new Atari games. The kid had seen a display in a window, bright boxes, cartoon explosions, a promise that nothing in life was complicated. The officer said yes too fast, then regretted it immediately. At the mall, he stood behind his son in an electronics store and stared at the plastic shells hanging on hooks. The labels were loud, innocent, exactly what they were supposed to be. And still, his brain began doing the thing it couldn't stop doing now, noticing screws, noticing seams, noticing weight. His son lifted one box and shook it lightly, smiling at the sound of something shifting inside. The officer reached out and gently stopped the motion, not with anger, just reflex, like catching a falling glass before it breaks. "Careful," he said, and heard how sharp it sounded. His son's face tightened, confused, then smoothed over with the quick forgiveness only children have. He put the box back like he'd done something wrong and moved on to the next aisle. The officer stood there and realized the worst part wasn't the job. It was that his fear had learned to travel. It had learned his family's address. A month later, an envelope arrived at work with his name typed cleanly on the front. Clearance review outcome. Extended. Access restrictions. Maintained. Position. Reassigned indefinitely. The wording didn't accuse him. It didn't clear him either. It treated him like a risk that had to be managed, not a person who had been used. He read the memo once, then folded it with the same pressure he'd used on his first carbon paper statement, as if pressing hard enough could imprint his innocence onto the page underneath. A carbon copy of effort. A double of a life that still wouldn't stick. He didn't show it to his wife right away. That night, she asked him quietly, tiredly, if it was really over. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to hand her a clean ending. Instead, he told her what the building had told him without saying it. It was over for the people who got arrested. It wasn't over for the people whose names had been bent. She stared at him for a long time, then nodded once like she'd expected it. Not anger, not drama, just the slow recalculation of their life. They tightened their budget again. They canceled one small luxury at a time until the house felt less like a home and more like a plan. Neighbors didn't ask questions, but their friendliness cooled. He could feel it in the way conversations ended early, in the way someone's porch light clicked off as he walked by. It was subtle enough to deny and obvious enough to hurt. At work, he learned what it meant to be present but not included. He was the guy people stopped talking around, the guy whose name made supervisors glance at paperwork before answering. One afternoon, he passed the evidence room door and heard a thin electronic hiss from a radio somewhere deeper inside a normal sound, in a building full of equipment, yet it hooked into him like a memory of being watched. He kept walking anyway, because that was what he'd trained himself to do. Keep walking. Don't become a problem. He hated how familiar that sounded now. At home, he finally did something he'd been avoiding since the day the cartridge vanished. He went to the closet and pulled out the Atari console his son had gotten for Christmas. He set it on the living room floor like a piece of evidence. His son crouched nearby, hopeful. The officer looked at the cartridge slot and felt his chest tighten with a feeling he didn't have a clean name for. He wasn't afraid of the machine itself. He was afraid of what it represented. That ordinary objects could be turned, and you wouldn't know until the paperwork came for you. He told his son they were going to pack it away for a while. Just for now. Just until Dad figured something out. His son didn't cry. He didn't argue. He just watched as the officer gathered the cartridges and stacked them carefully in a shoebox. When the box was full, the officer tapped it once against his palm to settle the contents, an old habit, automatic. Everything inside shifted, then went still. For a second, his breath caught, waiting for a rattle that wasn't there, waiting for the wrong kind of quiet. He realized he wasn't listening for sound anymore, he was listening for meaning. He sealed the box with tape and slid it onto the top shelf in the closet. He stood there longer than he needed to, staring at the cardboard like it might speak. Behind him, the house made its normal sounds. Refrigerator hum, pipes settling, a distant television laugh from a neighbor's window. And under it all, in the space where his mind had learned to listen for trouble, he heard nothing. No click, no hiss, no hidden message riding the wire. Not relief. Just the truth that stayed after the truth was proven. A man who had done the right thing, exposed the method, and still carried the cost because in the Cold War, the damage didn't always come from the enemy. Sometimes it came from the machinery around you, and sometimes it came from what that machinery taught you to become.